when we met, you mentioned that there was an Indian prime minister who said, "We're going to make non-dualism the pizza of India."
Oh, yeah,
So, can you talk about that and
sure.
also talk about some of the misconceptions that many people in the West have about non-dualism?
hmm Okay, I remember this conversation because I was recently just having
Pizza.
dinner with my uncle. I was having dinner with my uncle in London, and he was asking me to teach him some stuff about Indian philosophy, and I actually explained to him this very same thing
Hmm.
because it's a very good thing to understand. So, for lack of a better analogy, I'll say it the same way I said it to you, basically, and I hope your audience finds it humorous. But I think it would be really bad if we walked around thinking the greatest contribution of Italian cuisine to the world was pizza and pasta, because there's so many wonderful things in Italian food that just don't have to do with pizza and pasta. For example, I was watching a show yesterday about Umbrian lentils and how interesting it is and what you can do with Umbrian lentils in making Italian salads. And I found it totally fascinating and super interesting to think about making for myself. So it's the same thing. Radhakrishnan, the first sort of major figure of philosophy to step into the global space, he was the Spalding Chair of Eastern Religions at Oxford in the early part of the century. At one point, kind of made a decision that he kind of needed to like explain sort of what's the big contribution that Indian philosophers are making to the world, and he tended to have an Advaitin idea about it. He was kind of like, well, this is the one thing, we've got this non-dualism, it's in this one school, and he kind of presented, it's not like he didn't know about the other schools, for example. Let me just make that clear. He very much was one of the main people who put together an actual book, a source book in Indian philosophy with Charles Moore that contained like all these texts and everything. So he was vastly knowledgeable,
Hmm.
highly skilled rhetorician, an outstanding scholar, but he made some choices about what to present, and he decided that this was one of the things that he wanted to make clear to other people about Indian philosophy. It turns out that, as he already knew, that it's incorrect to think that this is the only school in Vedanta, first of all, specific. So Advaita Vedanta has become synonymous with Vedic thinking in a lot of the places outside of India, and even in India. That's all that people know. That's completely wrong. There are several schools of Vedanta. The one I work on is actually the one from Ramanuja, which is called Vishishta Advaita Vedanta. There's Abheda Beda, there's Dvaita, there's Madhva, there's a whole, I mean, it just goes on. It literally just goes, there's like a lot of these little sub schools, and they have very different views about what's going on in the Vedic tradition. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that Advaita Vedanta became kind of a lens where people would then look at the philosophy of the yoga school and try to interpret it through a Vedic lens when its actual roots were in the Sankhya tradition. It's a sister school of the Sankhya tradition. And so Sankhya and Vedanta are not the same in a lot of ways. Even many of the schools of Vedanta are different than Sankhya. But there was a tendency to try and like interpret even Sankhya in relationship to yoga through Vedic eyes. And so this became this large enterprise. And one of the things that came along with this was kind of this idea that this school is highly spiritual. And so this is like the vast depth of the spirituality of the Indian tradition coming forward. And there was little attention paid to the fact that Indian philosophers had other attributes as well that were also interesting and good. And what did some of those things have to do with? Well, one of the things that they had to do with was rationality and logic. That,
Hmm.
for example, is very
Interesting.
important. The other thing that it had to do with was theories of knowing. The other thing it had to do with was realism about the world as opposed to idealism about the world. So I predominantly work on what's known as the Nyaya school, which is a realist school, and it's an opponent of various forms of Buddhism. And I work on Ramanuja because he's a realist, actually, unlike Shankara, who's either an illusionist or a relative realist. So I tend to think that the Indian schools that were engaged in realism had something to offer as well, and they have interesting ideas and debates with these schools that are more idealistic, and they offer contributions that are less well known. And sometimes it's like the thing, like, oh, we're going to go get pizza because we're going to an Italian restaurant. Or we're going to
Uh-huh.
go study some Indian philosophy. We're going to learn some Vedanta. That's basically kind of what I told. And I want to make it clear. I don't know enough about the political situation of the time period in which Radhakrishnan was coming. I know he's an extremely erudite scholar, and I don't blame him in any way for what he did. There might have been political issues going
Sure.
on with the birth of India that made him think, hey, this is something that's important because I can put the spirituality of Advaita in. So he wrote this book where he talked about how spirituality is consistent with science. He actually, that's the title of the book, Science and Spirituality. And so he was concerned with wanting to, make things, better. But the person who replaced him at Oxford, Bimal Krishna Matilal, was a Nyayaka. And so he, for the next longest time, basically expounded on the Nyaya school and the relevance of it to debates in contemporary epistemology and logic. He studied with V.W.O. Quine at Harvard University and was a contemporary of P.F. Strawson at Oxford. He wrote perhaps my favorite book in Indian philosophy, Perception, an essay on classical Indian ways of knowing, which is a phenomenal work that engages a lot of analytic philosophy of the time period as well as Indian philosophy, and is also the inspiration for my continued efforts to follow by developing theories of perception in Indian philosophy along with analytic philosophy now. So that's a little bit of like the storyline that I think is common among scholars to know that there was this change of sort of things, and now there's become like a reemergence almost of interest in Advaita Vedanta because of the contemporary debates on theories of consciousness. So in that field, what has happened is, as you saw when I came to Mindfest at Susan's conference, there is a growing interest in the fact that some of the most contemporary moves being made in debates about consciousness, such as the panpsychist versions and theories promoted by lots of people nowadays, have strong resonances with very important trends in Indian philosophy. And so there's a lot of work being done now to understand how that conversation can unfold as well.
Boy, you said like a litany that's just fascinating.
Thanks.
There's quite a few threads. So one of them is there are some people who watch videos like this and they're in the West and they feel like they know plenty about the East or Buddhist traditions or Vedic traditions because they've watched Alan Watts or maybe read a couple books and done psychedelics, and they have this insight that's fairly prevalent in these circles that rationality and logic are the opposite of what you need in order to get some handle on the truth or reality. Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned that rationality and logic is something that wasn't advertised as coming from the East. It's more the non-dualist Advaita Vedanta that was. Mm-hmm. So can you please expound on that? And then also there may be a couple terms that come up that when they
so just to clarify, you want me to expound on what the relationship is between the development of rationality and logic in India and its relationship to these other non-dualistic ideas?
Yeah. The fact that you can understand, not just with irrationality and experience, but something analytic, something logical. Mm-hmm. When I say understand, I mean get to know oneself or get to know reality or get to know God or religion or spirituality. Because it's generally seen as two approaches. One is more experiential and one's more analytic. And the West is seen as more analytic and the East is seen more experiential. I'm painting broad strokes. I'm just saying, I'm sure you see this as well.
Yes.
Okay. And while you're explaining this, some terms may come up like illusionist or idealist or realist or relative realist. When they come up naturally, explain them, please.
Okay, sure. Thank you. That's a very good question. And I think it's something that I think my experience in writing and in research can sort of shed some light on in an insightful way. So one of the things I think that is a nice place to start is by looking at a common interpretation and presentation of Buddhism in the West. It's also found in India, but where a lot of what is the standard sort of thing to talk about there is mindfulness meditation. It is taken to be something that has sort of undergone a lot of neuroscientific investigation. I even know some of the people who work on that stuff. It's also something that has attracted a wide audience for various different types of people. And there's something about mindfulness meditation that's healing. It clearly has this property for lots of people. And there's a tendency to want to be interested in this component of Buddhism, not negatively in the sense of like I'm just going to put everything else away. But just, that's the thing. That's 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 the pizza for Buddhism, basically. Um, so one of the things that I have found in my research, and I actually wrote a fairly large piece on this actually because I had spent so much time thinking about it, was that it is not historically accurate at all to think that Buddhists weren't involved in the development of logical ideas, or that they themselves did not engage in some of the most vehement arguments with their opponents. So
Hmm.
Dharmakirti is considered to be, Dignaga and Dharmakirti are considered to be two of the most important Buddhist philosophers after Nagarjuna and the Buddha himself, obviously. And they spent a lot of time thinking about the rules for proper reasoning and about ways of knowing about the world. Their work is not so much presented in the discussion and conversation about meditation and how to live one's life, as you might find, for example, with people who talk about Shanti Deva. So Pema Chodron has a nice book about Shanti Deva, and I think a lot of people go to these kinds of works, or they go to the works that are talking about what to do with the stuff that arises in consciousness in terms of living a life and being compassionate. And these are, I want to make it clear to your audience, like in no way am I disparaging that. I have spent time myself meditating. I used to go to a Buddhist center like 2 times a week. I've done Vipassana in
Hmm.
India and everything.
He's on LSD right now.
So, but the thing I want to say is that it is just factually incorrect that they weren't engaged and thought logical reasoning was very important. The evidence is just too much. And in fact, I can point you just to one 780-page book by Daniel Perdue, which is a study of reasoning methods within the Buddhist tradition, within the Madhyamaka and Tibetan Buddhist traditions. It's an extremely powerful book. It might not be
Hmm.
accurate about everything that they came up with, but it definitely shows the rigorousness, the analyticity, so the analytical nature
Right.
of their minds. And I think it's very clear that actually learning to argue and learning to understand your own emotions through meditation and emotion regulation are two things that Buddhists care about. I think that the thing that, pushing the sort of one line is an incorrect thing. But that doesn't mean that, for example, you can't be like, well, the thing I'm coming here for is to get some peace and comfort. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just think that, like, yeah. So I think that's one place where you're going to find this sort of incorrect representation of, like, how rationality is present in the one thing. Like, people will be like, oh, but the Buddhists had it all right because it's like all the conceptualization and everything in our mind and all that analytic stuff is really bad. Well, sure, there is that storyline, but I mean, there is also this other stuff where, like, they're sitting there arguing with other schools, trying to figure out what is the best way to make a logical argument. There's a debate between the Jains and the Buddhists about what is the proper way to understand valid inference. It's a very intricate debate. It's very wonderful. So
Interesting.
it's just not. So that's number one, I would say.
Yeah.
Number two, that's directly sort of like the showstopper oftentimes, is this idea that idealism is prevalent or more prevalent in Indian philosophy, and materialism or reductionism is not. And that is just factually incorrect.
Okay, that's
The
interesting.
Charvaka school is a very prominent school of Indian philosophy that's in conversation with various Hindu schools, of the 6 of them roughly that there are, the Jain school and the Buddhist school, and they're around for quite some time. I don't have the exact records correct, but I have a friend, Ethan Mills, who worked on Charvaka, and he probably can inform us about the exact, like, correlation of when they were around and they debated people. And they totally have like a hardcore materialist theory of the mind, in the sense of, I mean, I don't want to use illusionism, which I'm going to talk about soon, to describe them, but maybe there's a version of the kind of illusionism that you find in contemporary philosophy floating around. Rather, what I think they have is this sort of tuning thesis, that it's just because you sort of get the neurons and the chemical things in the right way to mix in the same way that you get the thing up here, right? It's like purely determined by that thing. And I think the example they give is making beer. I think that's the one that, like, when you put the right ingredients in the right order, the beer just comes. That just is that. It's just like an emergent property, but it's just coming right out of that thing. I think that's kind of what that. So I'll tell you, Janardhan Ganeri has an excellent paper about emergentism in ancient Greek philosophy and in the Charvaka school in Brasapati. I teach this paper all the time. It's a wonderful read. It's so interesting to see how he portrays the sort of importance of this school. And then you can see, wow, I will never ever again say that there is no kind of like strong materialism or something in that school.
Henson, a family-owned aerospace parts manufacturer, has ventured beyond the realms of the International Space Station and the Mars rover to redefine your shaving experience. Henson Shaving's all about providing the best razor, not just the best razor business. So let's say goodbye to plastics, proprietary blades, and planned obsolescence. Henson is the epitome of affordability and sustainability. Further, once you own a Henson razor, it's a mere $3 to $5 per year to replace the blades. Head over to hensonshaving.com/everything. Choose the razor that suits your style and use the code everything to snag 2 years worth of blades for absolutely free. That's right, when you visit hensonshaving.com/everything and use the code everything, you'll receive an astounding 100 free blades. It's time to elevate your shaving game with Henson Shaving. If you enjoyed that clip, then the full podcast is out right now. You can click around here. Enjoy. Subscribe to Theories of Everything to get notified of upcoming podcasts, as there are new full-length podcasts every week on the topics of mathematics, physics, consciousness, free will, and AI.